Good evening. It's now 6 p.m. and the regular session of the Planning Commission of the City of Lancaster. Please come to order. Tonight we have an invocator, I believe. Pastor Arnwine, is it? Yes. Good evening and welcome. And our pledge will be offered by Commissioner Coronado. So, is Pastor Arnwine here? No, he's not. Well then, Vice Chair Hall will lead us in an invocation. Please stand.
Thank you, Chairman Bowes. Bow our head and think of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Lord, showing us true compassion for forgiving the shooter of their parishioners. That was truly an act of see your hand there when you allowed them to forgive them. I ask that you continue the blessings on them in this very difficult time. I pray that you continue to bless our city, its residents, and city staff. Bless this commission as we do the work that you want us to do. And I pray in your name. Amen.
Thank you. May I have the roll call, please?
Commissioners Diana Cook.
Present.
Miguel Coronado.
Present.
Cassandra Harvey. Absent. Raj Mali.
Here.
Fabian Teresiano. Absent. Vice Chair Randy Hall.
Here.
Chairman James Vose.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Public business from the floor. If any folks are here that can't stay for the entire meeting, we offer a period of 10 minutes at this time for anyone who would care to offer testimony on any of the agenda items. They would be limited to 2 minutes each. Do we have any early speakers? Nope. All right then, public business from the floor. If any person would like to address the commission on any agendized item, they're requested to fill out a speaker's card here and give it to the recording secretary. Individual speakers would be limited to 3 minutes each, and you'll be invited to address the commission when we call the item. First action item on our calendar tonight is the approval of minutes of the regular meeting of May 18th, 2015, and the minutes from our special meeting of April 27th, 2015. Could I have a motion, please?
I make a motion that we approved minutes from regular meeting of May 18, 2015, and minutes from the special meeting of April 27, 2015.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Please vote. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I wasn't at one of the meetings, but one of the meetings I was, so can we split those items?
We can, if you'd prefer. Any objection to that? Oh. All right, we'll take up then May 18th first, regular meeting. All right, so please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
All right then, and we'll take up April 17th then. So please vote.
Motion passes 4-0 with 1 abstention.
Thank you. I thought it's on. Maybe it's on now. Oops. All right, we'll start again. I will call then a continued public hearing for conditional use permit 1405, which is Love and Grace Christian Fellowship. This is a continued public hearing, so the hearing is still open. And the reason I don't know if the microphone is on is because when you wear hearing aids and are as deaf as I am, you think you're talking loud enough to where everyone can hear. I could hear just fine. How are you all doing out there? Everybody happy? Good. All right. So let's have a staff report, please.
Good evening, Chairman Bose, Commissioners. This is a continued public hearing for CUP 14-05. The applicant is Love and Grace Christian Fellowship. The location is 2052 West Avenue L. This is near the southwest corner of Avenue L and 20th Street West. And the request is for the construction operation of a 12,726 square foot church and the conversion of an existing 3,613 square foot residential structure for assembly use in the RR1 zone. This came before the Commission back in January. On January 26th, the Commission voted 7-0 to continue the public hearing for this request as a result of the applicant's contest to staff's recommendation and accompanying conditions. The applicant contested the requirements for street improvements as stated in a letter that was submitted back in January 19th. At that meeting, several representatives from the church clarified their concerns on the expense of off-site improvements and their desire to phase the timing for the project. Since then, staff has met with the applicant several times to work on a phasing plan that would work for them. There are essentially 3 phases to this plan. Phase 1 is the conversion of the existing residential structure to church and assembly use. Phase 2 is the construction of the majority of the new church located just to the east. So of the 12,000 square foot structure, they would build approximately 9,000 square foot of it. And phase 3 is the completion of the remainder of that church building. There are conditions that have been written to accompany each phase. Specifically, for phase 1, which is the conversion of the existing residential structure, the applicant would also improve 21st Street West, which is the street adjacent just to the west of the site. The dedication and improvement of 21st Street West shall be completed within 1 year from the date of Planning Commission approval, concurrent with the on-site improvements of the parking area, landscaping, and tenant improvements. So in addition to the conversion of the residential structure to church use, they would also be completing a good portion of the parking area immediately to the south. You can kind of see the dotted line of where they would be improving the parking lot to. So phase 1, conversion of the structure, parking lot, and 21st Street West. Phase 2, again, includes the construction of the new church building, or majority of it, and they would be required to improve Avenue L. The improvement of Avenue L includes a 6-foot wide sidewalk and an 8-foot wide landscape parkway between the curb and sidewalk along Avenue L. And so, and as far as the pavement's concerned, they would need to improve it to meet city requirements for streets and to connect to existing pavement. They're not required to build a median, but they would be required to install surface-mounted channelizers to restrict turning movements on Avenue L. For phase three, they would be expected to complete the rest of the building and pay a fee for the future construction of the raised median Avenue L. So staff believes that that we've worked with the applicant in a thorough manner to ensure that we meet the concerns of the applicants, but at the same time help the applicant in meeting the city's requirements for on-site and off-site improvements. Overall, we believe this is a good project. This is a location where it's a location that acts as a buffer between the urbanized uses north of Avenue L and the rural uses south of Avenue L. Again, the zoning for this property is RR1. That's rural residential, 1 acre lots. So the uses to the south is still rural residential, and we believe this is a good use as a buffer between the two land use designations. And with that, staff recommends approval of conditional use permit 14-05 with the conditions attached.
Thank you. Commission have any questions of staff before we hear from the applicant or any other folks that want to address us tonight?
I had
Go ahead.
a question. You said that you met with the applicant several times. Is that more than 3 times, or?
Twice in person, twice as in a more formalized setting, and then there were follow-up phone calls between myself and the applicant.
Did you, in those meetings, did you feel like that the applicant was agreeing with the conditions at the time?
I think those meetings were used to come to a common understanding of what the applicant's desires are. There was certainly an understanding that the existing residential structure was not adequate for assembly use, and I think that was the primary goal was to and the phase 1 reflects that. Phase 1 reflects conversion of that building to an assembly use, which requires upgrades to that building in terms of access, in terms of provision of bathrooms, which are all things they'll have to do to get a certificate of occupancy for a new type of use, which is assembly use. And our acting building official was involved in those meetings as well, and he had conveyed to the applicant the requirements for conversion of that residential structure to assembly use.
Could you explain to me why they have conditions like the building codes for the conversion process? Why do you have them as a city? I realize it's for building and safety, but could you explain to me?
The conditional use permit process, churches require a CUP in a residential zone because we need to evaluate the use in context of the adjacent residential uses. We need to evaluate the use in terms of how it complements or how different. We need to evaluate the intensity of the use and how it affects adjacent properties in terms of traffic, in terms of noise that could occur, in terms of events that they may have that may impact adjacent properties. This is a little bit unique situation where there is, initially when they came in for a CUP for a new church structure, and it came to our attention that there was an existing structure that was being used for assembly use that had not achieved the right level of occupancy or the right type of occupancy use. So there are conditions in here that are specific to building for the purpose of ensuring that this becomes an assembly use as required through a conditional use permit. Without these conditions, this is a structure that would not be permitted for occupancy for assembly use.
You said that there would be impacts, and what kind of impacts? Neighbors around there are separate. Why would you have to make improvements on 21st and Avenue L? What would be the reason for that? Is there a safety issue, or moving that many people in and out, or?
It's what we do for all development proposals, especially for proposals within a residential area that require a conditional use permit. We make sure that there are adequate improvements to accommodate the use, whether it's improvements to ensure that there's adequate ingress and egress. All those are common for our evaluation for development. Our improvements are in place and required for the purpose of functionality and operations, and so this is no different. It's a church use. We want to make sure there's adequate ingress egress, that there's on-site parking, that there's that streets adjacent to the property are improved so that they can accommodate all the users of the proposed use.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from members? Go ahead.
John, do you know, does it impact real estate values by having a church in the surrounding neighborhood? Does it increase or decrease or have any effect?
That is a question I do not have the answer for.
I think that's anybody's guess, really. One would hope that religious institutions have a positive effect on the environment we all live in. And I think by and large in our community, the last, 7 years, we've been considering conditional use permits for these types of facilities. They've generally been very positive. We've considered them in residential zones, commercial zones, industrial zones, all different sorts of locations. And I don't think we've had any code enforcement issues with church uses, have we?
I'm not aware of them. You will sometimes get a nuisance factor, people, if you've got a school associated with it or other things, but by and large, I don't remember many disputes between churches and neighbors. For the most part, even if they operate a lot, they're quiet a lot of the time too.
Yeah.
So.
You don't get many calls from the Sheriff's Department for service.
Correct.
That's good to hear. All right. Anything further from anyone? All right, then. Do we have speakers on this matter, Mr. Ludicky?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I actually have one speaker's card, but it identifies three members. I'm assuming they're members of the church who may be spokespeople. Corando Dolberry, David Cohen, and Delphine Cohen.
Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. How are you doing today?
And you're representing the applicant.
Yes.
Great. Our rules typically allow a 3-minute presentation from any speaker other than the applicant. The applicant can take as much time as they want, or that will allow, to present their case if you wish. So go right ahead.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to the city. Definitely thank you for you guys giving us an opportunity to step up. My apology. Definitely thank you guys for the opportunity to go back and reevaluate our building and our phases, allowing us to take this step by step as opposed to doing it all at once. So definitely really appreciate that. I think that with you guys giving us that opportunity, we were able to work with the city engineers as well as our own engineers to be able to phase things out appropriately, one of which has allowed us to really identify exactly what the means or what we'll need in order to make these phases. So I just wanted to say thank you guys for that opportunity. And at this particular time frame, there's no contestment on any of the phases or the stipulations or the resolutions, for that matter, that the city has given us.
So you have no objections to any of the conditions that have been provided to you that are in our agenda?
Correct.
Very good, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm David
Welcome.
Cowan. I am the owner of the property and the pastor of the church. And I just wanted to thank you again, like Deacon Dahlberry said, for allowing us to go back and take a real look at this and phasing out the property for us, and it helped us to get a better ballpark figure of what we were going to spend and the time range that we would need to do the things that we're going to do. And we were able to pace it out a whole lot better. So I want to thank you for that privilege. But as far as adding to the community, I really believe that a church adds not only just value to the community, but the church will add inspiration in the community, opportunities for education, and all of those things. And we are going to be a benefit within that community as soon as we're in operation, and especially in full operation. The things we're doing now are amazing, feeding the homeless, going to shelters and things like that, and helping in that community. And when we get to a level where we're going to have after-school care and housing and study and all that other stuff, I think that will be a benefit to the community. And as far as property values, I think anytime you add a $5 to $10 million structure, it raises everybody's value. If it's a structure that is an asset and looks good in the community. And I believe that the design that we have really adds to the color of the community and fits in right well with the community. It's going to beautify the city itself when they come through that corner. They're going to say, this is really top notch. And I'm glad you gave us time to do it, because it's going to help us get our plans together, which are already together. And I just wanted to add one more thing. I want to thank Mr. Ludicky and Mr. Ng for working so diligently with us, and Ms. Cantrell for working so diligently with us to help us understand. I'm a 33-year retired postman, so I don't really understand engineering and stuff, but they broke it down and they made it real plain for us, and I really appreciate that.
Very good, and thank you. We're grateful to hear any compliments that you give our city staff. We certainly appreciate their work, but it's very nice to hear it from the public as well. And thank you. Have any other speakers on this?
No other cards on this item, Mr. Chairman.
All right. So it's clear from the applicant that they accept all the conditions, the phasing plan and all the conditions. Is that everyone's understanding?
The concern I had is in our normal procedures, we have a form that says contested letters or uncontested letters against conditions, and for some reason we didn't receive that on this one. So I just want to make sure that we repeat that over again, that you have no, if we give the okay for the CUP tonight, you're willing to follow through with the conditions and willing to do the first phase within the year.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. Thank you. Anything else from anyone? All right, then it would be appropriate to close the public hearing without objection and consider a motion on this matter.
I'll raise a motion. I move to adopt resolution number 15-01, approving conditional use permit number 14-05.
I second that.
Thank you. Further comments? Please vote. Well, hang on a minute. Now we can vote. There we go.
Motion passes 5-0.
Very good. Congratulations and best of luck. All right, the next matter is our new public hearings. The first is conditional use permit 1402. The applicant is Abbey Road Development. So without objection, the new public hearings are open. And we have received in this particular case maybe we have an uncontested letter. Oh, I see. For a minute there, I thought I was listening to a Beatles song, Abbey Road, Penny Lane. Actually, I remember the Beatles in person, 1961 in, well, I won't tell you where. So, do we have speakers on this matter?
We do, Mr. Chairman, but they're both representing the applicant.
Okay. Shall we have a brief report?
Good evening, Commissioners. Again, conditional use permit 14-12 is located just south of Avenue K and just east of Division Street, adjacent to future Sahuayo Street. This is a proposal for a mixed-use, 3-story building, totaling about 78,000 square feet, most of which will be used for 75 multifamily housing units and about 5,000 square feet for office uses and support services. The mixed-use 3-story building, again, 75 multifamily housing units and office uses and support services. Of the 75 multifamily units, 37 are for supportive housing units for use by veterans recovering from homelessness. 19 units are supportive housing units for use by individuals and families recovering from homelessness, and 18 are housing units for very low-income households. The social services that will be offered include general support, mental health, and employment services. Of the 75 multifamily housing units, 30 of them are efficiency units or studios, measuring approximately 458 square feet. 15 units are one-bedroom units, measuring approximately 566 square feet. 24 units are two bedrooms, measuring approximately 803 square feet, and there are 6 three-bedroom units measuring approximately 1,215 square feet. As part of the proposal, the applicant is providing on-site parking. This parking lot is adjacent to the parking that's provided for the existing Penny Lane facility just located to the west. They will improve Sahuayo Street, which is adjacent to the property site to the east. Staff believes that this is a good project for adding a variety of housing to the city's housing stock. But more so, given the supportive services that's accompanying the proposed residential units, staff believes that this is a project that the Planning Commission can approve, given the conditions that are attached to this CUP.
Thank you. Any questions from the members? Go ahead.
How do we assure that the services are being provided, and not only the services are being provided, but the housing units for homeless or anybody else is going to be implemented, and how are we going to be able to track that?
That's a question that I'll kind of leave for the applicant to respond to.
All right, anything further from anyone? All right, may we hear from the applicant then, please, or applicants?
We have Joanne Yokota.
Good evening, Ms. Yokota, and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Chairman Voss and Commissioners. My name's Joanne Yokota, and I represent Abbey Road, Inc., which is a subsidiary of Penny Lane Centers. And maybe some of you are familiar with Penny Lane Centers, but they have a social service agency and offices located adjacent to the proposed site. And they've been there for a number of years, providing mental health services, services for youth and young adults who are transitioning from foster care or foster housing into permanent housing. The goal of this project is to provide, we call it permanent housing, but apartments. It's not a shelter situation, but people move in and pay rent, and they're qualified to meet the requirements of the program. Our funding agencies are going to be the state and county, which we will be applying for once we have approval of the CUP. And those agencies will be the ones that will monitor and regulate the occupancy and status of the tenants in the project. And that will be ongoing for, I think, 55 years. So hopefully we won't be addressing homelessness for 55 years, but we will be addressing low-income housing for families and veterans. And we have accepted all of the conditions that the staff has proposed. So, Peter.
All right, Commissioner Coronado may have a question, or did you want to pose it to this?
I'll restate the question. I think you kind of answered it. How is it that we are assured that the apartments are going to be rented for homeless people or veterans or low-income people?
Yeah.
How are you monitoring that,
right.
and how are you going to track that?
So we will actually be, once the project is built with the financing from the city and from the county and the state, then they actually come out annually and review all the files. We're required to meet those occupancy requirements. We're going to dedicate 50% of the project to veterans, and we'll be working with the VA to qualify the tenants, and also to provide the support services. And all of that is written up in our proposals to the state and the county. And it's a pretty elaborate system that they've set up. It's also monitored by the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And maybe you've heard about the tax credit program, but they also come out annually and monitor. And there's severe penalties if you don't meet the requirements. You could lose your project, or, you could lose your ability to operate it, and somebody else could end up operating it. But once it's financed, the agencies will make sure that it will always be for the intended use. Does that answer your question?
Are they,
Questions?
as I recall, this is a conditional use permit because it's in a commercial area. If it was in a residentially zoned, we wouldn't be hearing a conditional use permit on this matter. Just to clarify, are there any other facilities of this nature in our community? Is this the first?
I think you do have affordable housing.
Yeah, definitely an affordable housing, but one that's dedicated for this purpose.
And Penny Lane is actually involved in one, but not for veterans. I think, is there one being built right now for veterans?
There have been inquiries in regards to it, but this is the first project that has moved forward. In answer to Chairman Voss's question, I would say the closest that we have to this is that I believe the project that I forget the name of right now, but it's at Sierra Highway in Jackman. The AV Mental Health, or the Mental Health Association, operates offices and services there, and I believe a certain number of those units are available as transitional housing for those people. Yes.
That was, if I recall, it had some support from the City and Redevelopment Agency when it was developed.
Correct.
Where in this case, this is a county and federal, or county
Or
and
state,
state?
yeah. If you recall, there was a proposition that went forward to provide financing for veterans housing, just approved last year. And so that's the funding that we'll be using.
So with the approval of the conditional use permit, then that gives you the entree for applying for the funding opportunity so you can proceed with the
Right,
project.
exactly.
If you're not successful, the project would not go forward.
Right, right.
I see.
And we located it adjacent to the Penny Lane centers because that is advantageous for us to be able to provide services and the synergy between the two projects.
Plus, there's a number of other county facilities, county support facilities
Right.
to the south,
Yes.
within walking distance, actually, right?
Yeah, there are. So we think it's ideal.
Good site selection, right. Very good. Any other questions of the applicant? All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else care to address us? No? All right. No other speaker cards? None? All right, then. Any questions from members or comments? All right, then. So without objection, we'll close the public hearing on this matter and consider a motion.
I make a motion that we adopt resolution number 15-08, approving conditional use permit number 14-12.
Thank you.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Anything further? Please vote. Do it again.
Motion passes 5-0.
Very good. Congratulations and good luck on your application.
Thank you very much.
All right, then, the next public hearing is conditional use permit 1505. The applicant is Edison Andres Gomez. It's Rio Brazil Grill. So, without objection, this public hearing is also open, and for the record, we did receive a uncontested letter on this one as well. However, anyone care to hear the staff report? Anyone? No? Does the applicant have a compelling desire to speak to us? Good. So, why don't you introduce yourself and come right on up.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brianna Cabrera, and this is my husband, Edison. We're actually very excited to be a part of the city, adding a new type of restaurant to this community. The community's been growing a lot in the past few years and adding a lot of cultural things, especially within the boulevard. So we believe our restaurant would be a great addition to add to that. As far as beer and wine goes, it accompanies food, and ours is all about meat. So when people come to dine at our restaurant, they really want to have a full experience. So it's not a bar, it's more about the dining experience. So we believe that would be a great experience to add.
I second that.
Smart man, smart man. All right then, thank you.
Thank you.
So any questions or comments from the members? Staff? Nope? All right then. Be appropriate to close the public hearing without objection and consider a motion on this application.
I'll make a motion that we adopt resolution number 15-09, approving conditional use permit 1505.
And thank you. Have a second, please?
I'll second that.
Thank you. All right then, anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Very good. Congratulations. All right, then, new business. Item number 5, which is the proposed scope of review for a portion of the alcohol ordinance and conditions. We have the presenters tonight at our subcommittee, Vice Chair Hall, Commissioner Cook, and Coronado, as well as Brian Ludicky, our planning director. So you guys have the floor.
Okay. I want to thank all of those that worked on this subcommittee project. We have Brian Ludicky, we had Randy Davis, Chun In, Commissioners Diana Cook, Dr. Coronado, and Jeff Little from another commission. Due to the time frame and the expedited nature of this review of the alcohol ordinance, the effort put forth by this group was to be commended. We overcame some obstacles to make this happen. It's on. Anybody
Can
else
you
not hear
push
me?
it just slightly forward? We're having a little trouble hearing you. Thank you.
Do you want me to start all over, or? No, okay. So the nature of Lancaster's municipal code for selling alcohol has been in effect since 2008, and Lancaster has issued 60 conditional use permits to sell alcohol, and only 2 of these have been revoked for violating their conditions. This showed me and the subcommission the quality of effort that went into the municipal code, and thanks to diligent work by staff, we were able to identify a few areas that could be modified and should be our topics tonight. Number 1 should be the floor area required to be devoted to fresh meat and produce from 10% to possibly 15 or 20%. This is so that a market doesn't use regulations to become a liquor store, probably one of the main reasons we had this subcommittee. The floor area devoted to alcohol display allows flexibility for different sized businesses. There's one issue I thought was kind of interesting. Convenience stores that only sell beer and wine, we could consider those incidental sellers, but if they decided to sell liquor, then they would be subject to separation distances. This would make it more difficult to sell the spirits and liquor and stuff. And then finally, the last one would be the size of the single cell containers, which is probably the last one on purpose because it's the one that's going to be the hardest one to come up with. The subcommission said that we were supposed to have samples up here, and I don't see any samples. So I suggest that we stay on these topics, and I think that will satisfy the mandate that we were given, and it will make the changes in our alcohol ordinances that will make very good regulations even better. So the number 1 thing that we should look at was the floor area required, and that's one of the conditions for a convenience store to make sure that if they do decide to sell alcohol, that they have to then provide meat and produce also, so that it becomes more of a market. I suggested that when I saw the first part of the memorandum from Mr. Ludicky that we give an idea of how much, and I just off the top of my head said 15 or 20% should be dedicated to that. So does anybody have any ideas on what they'd like to bring up on that, or?
I would like to see it go at least to 20%, because I do want to close the loophole and make sure that convenient markets are convenience markets and that mini markets are mini markets, and I want to make sure that they're not getting around the ordinance by finding a loophole and indeed becoming a liquor store.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? So the process, if I understand, after our discussion this evening, and then assuming we come to, I won't call it a consensus, but a directive to staff, then at a future meeting we'll be looking at a proposed modification to the ordinances that these areas of concern. Would that be the way it will go?
Yes, it would depend obviously on what the consensus of the commission is, and you don't bind yourself to a certain action by reaching consensus on an approach. a couple of the things in here would actually require amendment of the ordinance itself. That includes the definition of the convenience store.
Right.
Other things such as the single container issue, sizes of that, aren't really established by the ordinance. It's established more by practice as far as what the commission has adopted as conditions. Those are not really ordinance conditions. Obviously, you can choose to look at those in another manner and say we'd like to reconsider them. I apologize for no containers, but if you do, in all seriousness, want to, at some future meeting, look at sizing, we'd be more than happy to provide them, provided you have some direction as to which ones you want to look at.
So sizes of containers could be on an individual CUP basis type of thing, or should we have some overarching kind of guideline so somebody doesn't say they're being treated unfairly?
I'm going to answer that as yes. And the reason for it is this. The reason that we wrote the code originally and was adopted the way it's adopted is so that flexibility exists. There are situations where single container sales may be perfectly fine, and in fact, I'll just tell you, sitting from my position as the director of planning, I think we ought to give some consideration to loosening some of those up a little bit, or maybe taking a different tact. But there are also places where you may not want to have that, particularly if you have a lot of nearby uses that may be a little more sensitive, or situations that you just don't want that single container to be available. And we have done it both ways. We went back and looked at several conditional use permits that were adopted for convenience stores, and there are cases where you as a commission allowed them single containers, for instance, of beer or malted beverages, but they had to be a certain size. There are other situations where you didn't allow them to have single containers at all. And I think that's perfectly fine to be able to look and judge that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, from my perspective, as long as we are cognizant of making sure that the reasons for that decision-making are in the staff report and in your findings.
So, you're addressing the hardest, potentially the most difficult or the most challenging in container size and how it's distributed. So let me focus us back on the first task, if we can. Convenience markets, and Commissioner Cook's from my chair is correct. They should be for convenience of the community in which they serve, and I would imagine their radius of service might be, certainly it would be less than a supermarket, which is typically 2.5–3 mile radius. Maybe a convenience market is half mile to a mile, probably. That would just be my point of view at any rate. I have no objection to the 20%. If you were comparing, and maybe this is something that ought to be addressed as well. In typical supermarket, fresh produce, fresh meat, deli, that type of thing, takes up a certain amount of floor space, including the prep area and the cold storage and all the rest. It's also a considerable amount of pre-prepared foods and frozen foods. So I don't know if we want to consider that as part of convenience floor space. Maybe we don't. Maybe that really gets too complicated. I don't know.
There's another issue too, and that is that there might be smaller stores that 20% might be just too onerous. So is it possible that it could be written to where the guideline or the regulation is 20%, but it could be modified from here
I think the commission has the authority to make a finding on any conditional use permit. You know, as long as it's not in conflict with a city ordinance, I think we have the authority to make that finding. Do we not?
Yes, that would be true.
The ordinance itself just says fresh meat and produce right now. So if we did like Chairman Bose said and started going into all the details, then how big would the ordinance become? Would it become unwieldy? Could it just still be, leave the language the same but just increase the floor space so we don't have to come up with every contingency and have 14 pages of what can be served and what can't be considered?
Yes, and I think that, and I think you, as a commission, you exercise this judgment on the case at K8 and 20th West that you heard several months ago. It's still within your purview as a commission to kind of look at things and make that judgment. Is this really what the request appears to be? Staff is always going to look at how things line up with accepted ordinance and you know, the city's policies and requirements, and we'll make our recommendations based on that. But I think it's certainly within your purview as a commission to look a little beyond that and say, I understand that it meets the actual definition, but in practice, is that what this really is? Let me give a little bit of background so that the two members that were not part of the subcommittee that are here understand the whole reason that we even created this definition in the first place. It was really designed so that what you might call the for lack of a better term, the ethnic food market or the Ben's Corner type of operation would be able to be approved in some manner and not fall under the definition of a mini market. Those of you who are familiar, for instance, with Remy's Oriental Market or something like that, recognize very well offhand, as is Ben's Corner, these are not mini markets. They don't operate in the same way. But it's hard to define something by you know, it's an ethnic food store, for example. So we came up instead with a way to try to define it and said, well, we're going to assume that these establishments have some amount of fresh meat, fresh produce available. What's happened, though, and I think the subcommittee really zeroed in on this, is that the definition as it's in there now has kind of been discovered by people who are not necessarily trying to do what we intended it to do. And the reason that they're trying to do that is because, unlike a mini market, a convenience store doesn't right now have to comply with the separation distances. It's treated the same way as a drugstore or a supermarket is, as an incidental seller. And I think what the desire, as I understood it, of the subcommittee was to say, hey, we think there's still a valid place for this, but this definition needs to be tightened up, because what's happening is people who don't really want to operate, you know, true convenience stores as we envision them are kind of trying to slide into that definition and sort of do the minimum to do that. And I think what you're seeing is in an attempt to try to address part of that concern.
So if we did bump it up from 10 to 20%, the overall effect would be to make it more difficult for them to slide in. And isn't that the goal of what we were trying to do? So I would think that would be our first thing in the ordinance right there, if the commission agrees, would be to at least make that change or recommendation for change.
I'm not hearing any objection from anyone. So
I agree.
The second part then would be the part that Mr. Ludicky just almost alluded to there, and that was is if we do have a convenience store that sells spirits or hard liquor, if they decide to only sell beer and wine, they could be considered incidental sellers, which would then allow an incentive to be, the incentive would be then to not sell liquor, and they wouldn't be subject to the distance requirements. It would make an incentive instead of a negative type of thing. But it might be another loophole in the future that another commission might have to look at. Any thoughts on that? I thought that was an excellent suggestion from when we were in the committee, that if we give choices are always good for our business community. Person that was wanting to open up a convenience store that would then serve a community for convenience could say, well, I can't do that because if I wanted to sell the liquor, then I'd have to have these separation distances. But if I just decide to sell the beer and the wine, then he would be an incidental seller and be treated like a supermarket or a drugstore. Might be an incentive for them not to sell the liquor. They'd still be selling beer and wine.
I think anyone, at least from my point of view, would be challenged to present an application to sell spirits and get it approved by this commission, other than a bona fide restaurant or a supermarket. And if they're supermarkets, they're exempt, and if they're bona fide restaurants, they require a conditional use permit. So are you suggesting then that if a convenience market chose to sell beer and wine, they wouldn't require a conditional use permit?
No, that's not the point at all. The point at all is to give them a choice in whether or not they would decide to have the more difficult requirements for a primary seller.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the more difficult, the better. That's just me. When you look at the, if you look at the number of the statistical information that was provided to us, the number of businesses that are purveyors of alcoholic beverages, and if you look at the types of businesses in our community, at least since the last 7 or 8 years, since we've had has it been 6 years since we adopted the alcohol 2009, I think it was, or something like that, that we recommended and the city council adopted it. We've not had, quote, a liquor store make an application, nor have we ever approved one. However, there's 20 in our community, quote, liquor stores that purvey every type of alcoholic beverage or can, I guess. We've had a number of mini marts considered, and we've had a number of convenience markets considered. So, I think we've been fairly liberal on the applicants. We've had nightclubs, we've had drugstores, we've had certainly a considerable number of bona fide restaurants applying, some of which are no longer in business. Probably 20% or more of the folks that got permits are currently not even in business. So, anyway, so statistically, this commission and city have not been at all what I would consider generous in approving facilities that dispense spirits. Beer and wine typically is certainly easier than conveyors of spirits. And that's just fine with me. So, do we need to tighten that up any more? I don't know. I mean, it's pretty tight now. What are we trying to accomplish? Just the convenience market piece, do you think?
Well, on our K8 and 20th, an example might be he was having trouble getting us to agree to his idea for a convenience store. he could have said, well, I choose only to sell beer and wine, and then he wouldn't have separation requirements. We might have been more open to allow him to sell the craft beers and stuff like that.
Or not.
Or not. But then there was another option there that keeps all the conditions in place. It keeps it, doesn't make it any easier. It just gives an option. Something that staff could be sitting with an applicant in a back room and say, here's another option. And
Well, it's been said, and I've heard it expressed by others in our community, both appointed and elected, that there's been a considerable number of liquor stores approved. Well, there's been none since we've had a commission. We've been on the commission here. I don't recall any. Do you, Raj? Liquor stores? So, there haven't been any. So, to focus on convenience markets and mini markets, I think is appropriate. Liquor stores tend to take care of themselves if someone should be so brave as to apply. Even though it's purely a judgment call on the members of the commission, we certainly couldn't say that we would disallow or disapprove an application before one is presented.
the third part of dealing with the convenience market would be the floor area allowed for alcohol display. There has been some talk about it being changed from 10% of floor area, and how is the floor area described? Is it cubic feet, or is so many cubic feet? Because we can have shelving that only takes up 10%, but you could have, you know, for lack of a better term, a ton of alcohol in that 10% area stacked to the ceiling. So that's an area that we could discuss up here. Do we want to decrease that? Do we want to define that better?
I don't know how we get our arms around it, but I think it's a good idea.
Mr. Ludicky, do you have any suggestions on how we could get our arms around that part?
I think we can pick whatever number seems reasonable. I would tell you that despite the concern about shelving and other kinds of things, that's a very hard condition to kind of manage in the field, an idea of volume, if you will, cubic feet or something. I would keep it at some percentage of the floor area, maybe define whether that's of the gross or whatever, or the sales floor area as opposed to, you know, storage and so forth. And then pick what you think is an appropriate number. I mean, I think the thing that to keep in mind on the issue of things like drugstores, supermarkets, convenience markets as they're currently done, the idea of those is they're supposed to be incidental sellers of alcohol. And I think one of the things that, you know, after listening to the subcommittee members discuss this and going back and looking at the convenience market definition, I mean, it basically sets, you know, right now, beer and wine or alcohol sales floor area at the exact same percentage as, you know, the produce and fresh meat. So certainly something's a little bit probably needs to be adjusted there. You could always look at lowering the total floor area for convenience markets as far as alcohol sales area or some other approach. You know, that's certainly within our ability as a city to do, as long as we demonstrate the public reason behind it.
So the question is, on your larger facilities, supermarkets and so forth, as I recall, it's what, 5%?
No, I think all incidental sellers are at 10.
Are they?
But you bring up a good point, because I went back and took a look at some of them, and we've had a lot of situations, and in fact the commission has commented at least a couple of times on this, where you had a 20,000 square foot user, and they were only proposing 400 square feet or 300 square feet of area for alcohol sales. Well, in theory, they could go to 10%. They could go to 2,000 square feet, and there was concern expressed in at least a few instances where the commission said, oh, we approve it at 400. We don't want it suddenly ballooning to 1,500. So even in some of those cases, you put limits on how far they could go, and said, hey, they're allowed to expand another 100 feet, but they can't expand beyond that without rethinking the use permit. So my guess is that 10% is fairly generous, given what we've seen. Now, we can, if you want, as a staff, go back and take a closer look at that, but particularly when you start getting into, 40,000, even the 40,000 square foot neighborhood market concepts now, at 10%, that would be 4,000 square feet of alcoholic sales floor area. That's
probably less than 2% in
That's
reality.
a lot.
It's probably
So,
less than 2% in reality.
You might want to rethink it.
So if we took the floor area percentage out of the ordinance entirely
Yes.
and considered every application on its own merit, would that be considered reasonable?
I would. She sighed louder than I did. I would say
You
this.
don't always have to listen. I mean, we love our assistant city attorney, but you don't always have to listen to the attorneys, ever.
You never have to listen to the attorney if you don't want to.
I only listen to the ones I pay.
There's a part of me that says, sure, why not do that? But there's another part of me that says, no, I'd rather have at least some standard in there.
Well, it's easier for staff, but
Yeah.
it gives the commission and the city council all the flexibility that they might require. I mean, if we approve something and the city council calls it up and disapproves it, or vice versa, it's taken up on appeal, we've been on both sides of the fence on this.
Might I make this suggestion? We can do a little bit of research and see what the maximum amount of percentage has been, at least so far under the ordinance, for the convenience market or some others, and see what they've done generally.
So we need to make sure that when we look at that we say that the refrigerated beer and wine and stuff like that that's in refrigerated would count on that floor space and not just crates stacked on the floor.
Yeah, the floor area thing, and we would obviously want to include towards the wall where you have the walk-in cooler approaches and things like that. But I can tell you, Chun and I went out to investigate one particular place, and yes, they were within the limits of where they had shown on the plan, but what they had also done was areas that would normally be aisles suddenly had a lot of, warm cases of beer stacked. Is that okay? Yeah, probably so. I think it speaks, though, again, to whether whether 10% is a little too generous. That was just a number that we thought was reasonable at the time, but as is always the case, we can go back and evaluate that. Maybe it's too much.
So we shouldn't really just throw out a number like, say, 2% or 5%. We should wait until another time, or?
Well, my recommendation is going to be that when you define an incidental cellar, that you define some kind of percentage of floor area. And I think we might even do it on sort of a sliding scale, if I remember correctly. But I really do think you need to have that in there, because it begins to tie back into the definition of what's an incidental versus a primary cellar. And those then tie to the separation distances that exist. So,
Well, due to the expedited nature of what we've had to do with this, I think that your suggestion on a sliding scale per applicant would be an appropriate way of dealing with this.
Yeah, we might even want to take a look at your typical convenience market configuration, how many are out there and what their square footage might be. I mean, it's a 1,500 square foot store, At 10%, it's 150 square feet.
Right.
Pretty good size.
So if you have a 10-foot long walk-in, 5-foot deep, there's a third of your floor space. And you can stack that cooler,
Right.
put it to the ceiling.
Yeah.
With product, and those beverages need to stay cold, otherwise the shelf life deteriorates and they lose money, right? You can't just leave them sit out in the, right? You have to keep them in a cooler. Some of the product, otherwise it'll deteriorate on the shelf. So, you have to be careful of that, I would think.
Right.
Don't want to be unreasonable. Let's get to the easy one, beverage size.
I just want to make sure on recap, on the three things for definition of a convenience store, do we have direction here? Do we have stuff pointed out? Because I still feel like it's just kind of like floating around and we didn't really nail anything down yet.
Well, and as I said, what staff will do is return to you with some recommendations for your consideration. But as of right now, what I understand is an increase in the required floor area for fresh meat and produce in a convenience market.
To 20%.
Yeah, looking at 20%. A reconsideration of what the percentage of floor area ought to be for incidental sellers on alcohol. And I think we're going to go back and look at not only what have been the percentages of some of the typical cases that we've approved over the last few years, but what we've seen in floor plans of different types, mini market in particular, because they obviously are a part of that. And we'll also, I heard a pretty good discussion on whether to amend the code to deal with convenience markets that want to sell spirits versus those that don't. Should we have primary versus incidental sellers in that? But I didn't hear any desire to really shift that at this point, at least in a consensus basis.
Yeah, that was my feeling too. So the first two seem to be.
Right.
So then we can move on to the really easy one here.
When you make the statement of convenience markets that sell alcohol, you're really focusing on beer and wine as opposed to distilled spirits.
Yes. That's one other thing you could do. And once again, this is, it's one of those things, kind of what are you looking at doing with it? You could always say that a convenience market is a convenience market if it sells beer and wine, but if it sells spirits, it just no longer falls under that definition. It becomes something else. That's another approach that you could do regulatory if you really want to look at not having convenience markets that sell spirits. That would be a fairly easy way to take care of that.
I like that idea.
I think you have a consensus potentially there on that.
Okay.
issue.
And then our size selling, I think that could be evaluated on each individual basis up here.
The size?
Sizes of the single.
I asked Randy Davis, our assistant planner, to do a little bit of research on a few cities that, they're cities that seem to be popular with people, and I just wanted to kind of see what they did. I think they were Pasadena, Glendale, and Burbank, and she did the research on that. I'd like her to kind of tell you what she found.
Sure. On the three cities that we looked at, like Brian said, Glendale, Burbank, and Pasadena, actually they have no minimum on container sizes. I also found out that, as long as they felt that the proposed use wasn't going to have an impact on the community and it was going into, they didn't look at distance requirements if they were going to sell spirits. So I thought it was a little bit surprising, but none of the cities had any regulations even close to what we currently have. And I asked them, with the different things that are coming up with the craft beers and things like that, and they didn't have any issues with the little, what do you call them, shot sizes. They didn't have any issues with that at all. And I said, so, because could a person open up a convenience store and sell beer, wine, and spirits, and it was abutting residential, and they said yes, as long as they felt that the use benefited the neighborhood.
So were they all conditional use permit applications, or they were just approved by staff?
Not all of them. In some cities, I think it was Burbank and Glendale, they had like little areas of town where a conditional use permit was required if there was another one in the general vicinity, or if they were located like similar to like a downtown area, then they didn't require a CUP.
I've heard it said, and I'll paraphrase, that we don't necessarily care what other cities do. That's probably not a direct quote, but I think we have an understanding of what that means. Do we not? So, thank you. So what do you suggest? What do you suggest?
I don't mean to interrupt you,
Go ahead,
Chairman.
go ahead.
I appreciate that report, but that really, I think in our position to be objective and serve our community, I don't think that works for me personally. But I do appreciate you doing the research on it.
Thank you. So do we want to take up single container sales as a policy, or do we want to modify the policy, or do we want to consider it on every application individually?
Let's start with the easier one. We don't write. There is actually an easier one.
Sure. Go ahead.
People never believe me, but one of the things that did come up in the discussion on the recent convenience market was the issue of spirits and the sizes of spirits containers. Now, by and large, we haven't had a lot of those applications come across. Most of them are for beer and wine. But in the case of spirits, we may be able to kind of limit what the minimum sizes of those are pretty readily, and at least deal with that if the commission is interested in dealing with the small bottle concern of spirits. Now, this is going to apply primarily in a supermarket or a drugstore or something like that. But as far as I can tell, we've never placed a condition on any of the ones we've approved on spirits, on the size of spirits. We've done it for wine, we've done it for malted beverages, but not on spirits. So,
I think if you look at your typical supermarket or drugstore, you will find that their typical spirit sales are in 750 milliliter or larger. They don't typically sell the single shots or what used to be called a half pint or a pint, which is what now, 250 milliliters or 500 milliliters or whatever. I mean, the old designation was a fifth. Remember that designation? Well, you might not remember, Brian, you're too young. Others may. Randy remembers.
I remember everything.
Mostly. So, I think if you take a look at the Walgreens and CVS's and Albertsons and those folks, Costco, you'll see the size. The container size is typically not a concern. It's the purveyors of in the neighborhood locations or in areas where, in my point of view, misuses are happening. So.
yeah, I think it's more of a liquor store type of an issue, but.
All right, anything else?
If we modified the size of the spirit sale bottles to 750 milliliters or a fifth, would that be to all liquor stores? Would they end up having to pull those pints and half pints off their shelves?
Well, prospectively going forward, yes, but not for any use that's already operating legally, unless there was something about the nature of it that changed such that they needed a new use permit. I'll share this because I think it is important to understand. I believe I shared this with the subcommittee members also. The purveyors of alcohol in the community, the retail establishments, they are keenly aware of the city's actions in regards to single container sales and the restrictions that we've placed on that. I can tell you of at least 2 establishments that have come to me at various times and said they wanted to expand their floor area, and I said, well, if you do that, you're going to need a new use permit, and you are going to get restrictions on your container sales, your single cans, basically. And they backed off of those plans because of that. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing, but it certainly is something they take into consideration. One of the things that maybe I'll let you discuss that, the idea of
You'll recall that the last CUP that was denied and then was appealed before council, they had issues with the condition requiring no single containers, specifically beer, and the contention was that craft beers tend to be more expensive, and it's not fair to expect a customer to come in and buy a 6-pack of a craft beer. What if they don't like it and they want to try another craft beer? I do know that in other cities, I live down below, and that in Los Angeles, a lot of stores provide for a 4-pack or a 6-pack where you can mix and match. You still have to buy a 6-pack, but it can be one of 6 different kinds of craft beers, and that's one of the ways that they seem to allow for testing and trying, but not spending whatever for a 6-pack of a craft beer, which I guess is more expensive. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Any comments from anyone on that?
Well, it would be a guideline if we did something like that. It says we'll allow single sales as long as they're packaged in those 4-pack or 6-pack.
Yeah, I think if you look at the purveyors of that type of beverage and, your supermarkets and so forth, there's quite a few products that they sell, but certainly not in a great volume. I mean, if you look at the shelf stock, they're going to be 2 or 3 deep on those types of products because they're not a high seller. So
there is a drawback to requiring them to buy more, and that is you're getting more alcohol out into the community.
Yeah, it's true.
The other thing that's a positive is instead of spending $7 or $8 for a craft beer, now all of a sudden they have to spend $21 or $30 for a 4 or 6-pack, and then probably just bypass it.
Higher sales tax revenue, yeah. Think about that. Oh, it's another subject. All right, so shall you tell us what our consensus has been?
basically in the rare moments that we get a request that includes sale of spirits, and they're pretty rare, for off-site consumption, that there seems to be some desire on the part of the commission to consider a minimum size for those spirit containers. 750 milliliters was thrown out as an example. So I think we can probably come up with some language for that. Still a little bit uncertain about where you want to go on the malted beverage can kind of thing. Wine we seem to have been fairly settled on. I haven't heard many disputes about that. So I don't know whether there's a desire to talk about those, but we can come back to that. What we've generally tried to do, and the reason for the restrictions on single container sales, has been to try to avoid the I used to call it a freeway bag, if people may remember, the idea that you buy one typical can of malted beverage that you'd find typically in a six-pack of some kind, and you know, you pay 90 cents for it, and you're able to kind of just drink it and go. And the idea of limiting the single containers has been to try to discourage that particular kind of behavior. Not so much because I'm necessarily opposed to someone drinking one thing, but that can often kind of ends up, you know, being drunk out in a parking lot or somewhere else, and it's just a lot less likely to happen if somebody has to purchase more. So.
Well, that's a downside on the 40 ounces too, is if we require 40 ounces instead of having a 12-ounce can consumed in a parking lot, they have a 40-ounce can they're consuming in a parking lot.
Yeah, that's true.
There's some pretty good sized cans out there now.
Not 40 ounces, 22.
I buy the largest ones I can when I boil baby back ribs. So. Yeah, actually, no, that's probably an editorial comment. The cheaper the beer, the better it seems to work for the ribs.
It works good in pancakes too.
Okay.
Brats, too.
Yeah, very true.
Batter pancakes are delicious.
But let me ask this: is there some interest to, as the assistant city attorney noted, is there some interest in looking at providing a way for people who want to sell single cans of a certain thing, but requiring people to have to buy a minimum amount of them?
I think that's a good idea.
I mean, and once again, this kind of comes down to the ability to kind of look at the individual user. I don't think that's a reasonable approach in your typical mini market or maybe even your typical convenience market. But if you had if you had a Trader Joe's type store, is that reasonable? If you have a BevMo type store, is that a reasonable approach? I don't know.
It's an approach.
Yeah, I'm.
Only time will tell if it's reasonable or not.
Yeah. Well, I think what staff's trying to do is to look at the conditions that we typically draft and perhaps come up with some new ones for your consideration, you know, that would be available.
If we take them on a case-by-case basis, then we have the ability to determine the reasonability of the condition, do we not?
Yes, you do.
I'm not, I have no objection to considering most anything on a case-by-case basis, giving us, the city, the flexibility to make a determination of the suitability of the application, whatever it may be, not just focusing on this type of thing. I know state legislation and AG opinions have focused a lot of our decisions away from our consideration, but they haven't gone as far yet with the purveyors of alcoholic beverages.
Yeah, although it's a bit of an uneasy relationship because state ABC, you know, is still in theory the overseer of this, but we do get a reasonable amount of latitude from a land use standpoint.
So is there any way that sensible way to take up the review of existing facilities and purveyors and add conditions to their operation without objections from the public?
I will speak as far as my limited legal knowledge will let me. there is a provision in the city's ordinance currently that talks about deemed approved uses. And those are basically the uses that existed prior to the ordinance coming into effect. There are circumstances under which the city has the ability to go in and say a deemed approved use has become a public nuisance, and we have the right to go in and reevaluate and reconsider. The provisions are in there. I know that at the time the city attorney's office was, their comment was, if that ever occurs, it's going to require a considerable amount of review, because you're essentially stepping in and taking someone's legal right away. That's that's a much higher standard to have to hit than someone who's coming before you with a request. I suppose we can take a look at the language as it's drafted right now, look at any recent legal decisions in that regard, and see if the city's ability kind of remains the same. That provision hasn't been exercised as yet, and speaking only for me, there's a couple situations in the city right now where if you were ever going to exercise it, those would be the locations. But we haven't as yet. So
I can think of a few too.
Record.
That's why I raised the point. Maybe you ought to look at the raisin grower case that was recently published, where those folks had the opportunity, or were compelled to participate in a consortium. It may have a connection.
I'll look into that this week, Chairman Bose.
Well, have we flushed this out to everyone's satisfaction?
I feel like we've done what we were required to do, and it sounded like what we were mandated to do. And I think that we have some good suggestions on the table to consider and make some changes in the municipal code, and then present them to City Council and let them make the final decision.
Yep.
It looks like we did what we were asked to do.
Anyone else?
As far as I'm concerned, I want to make sure that thank Randy and Diana for the work they did. I missed one of the meetings, and the staff that took the initiative to take upon this. For me, this issue is extremely important and difficult to deal with, especially because of the work that I do with the community and as a result of drinking and driving. And as you probably read, the last couple of days, another kid had died under the circumstances. So, I mean, it's doing something. It's better than doing nothing. So I definitely commend the staff and the Planning Commission specifically, or my colleagues that took it upon to take the extra time to meet to do something rather than nothing. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right then, so in a few meetings or two from now, we'll have something to look at then.
Let me ask this question. Are you, given the parts that we would need to amend on the ordinance, is the commission comfortable enough yet to actually have that come before you as a hearing on an ordinance, or do you want to look at the language one more time before we put it into an ordinance form?
Well, having looked at what Jocelyn has written in the past, I'm pretty comfortable that we could bring it in and maybe mark it up on that day or not. It seems like we have quite a push to make this happen quickly. We don't want to
Okay. What we'll do then is we won't prepare an ordinance, won't notice it yet for your next meeting. We'll come back to you with the proposed language, let you have another opportunity to look at it and give direction, and then perhaps look at August as a date.
That's pretty fast moving there, considering our sensible sign ordinance.
All right, then. So we're finished with that report. Thank you very much again for your hard work.
It's my pleasure.
Director's announcements, Mr. Ludicky.
Speaking of that sensible sign ordinance, at this point, it looks like that will go to the council on July the 14th. And I understand that they are eager to see it. So.
Let's find out whether we're worth what we're paid, right?
Well, who's ever representing the commission at the 14th meeting will undoubtedly find themselves probably involved in some questions.
Dipped in beer and boiled?
I did not say that.
You did earlier.
Do you know something I don't know, Rand? Okay. All right, anything else, Mr. Ludicky?
No, that's it for my announcements.
All right, thank you. Anything for the commission on that you'd like to bring up?
I'd have one thing.
Go ahead.
I'm having to rip out my Golden Lawn portions of it, and I ran into a very interesting thing today with dumping my yard. I have to haul it in a pickup truck to the landfill. So I have 2 vouchers a year that are good for 1 ton apiece, and my yard was more like 4 tons. And so Waste Management said that it was a contract with the city, so I called the city and asked them, and I says, well, isn't this a drought emergency? Aren't we trying to make this happen? And in an emergency, some things should be, considered. And in my neighborhood, this is quite an epidemic of lawns being torn out. And it would seem to be an easy call to make. So, if it's just your yard being hauled in a pickup truck, you can dump as much of it as you want, because it's what we want as a community is to save the water. There, that's 2 cents.
So how much did you have to spend for the extra 2 loads?
Actually, I borrowed my neighbor's voucher.
Borrowed it, huh?
Yeah. With their permission.
Gee, I didn't know Waste Management offered vouchers. That's a good thing to know.
Oh, fiscal year is up on July 1st, and when I asked them, I said, well, what do I do with the stuff of the yard? Do I just leave it on the sidewalk? Take that up with code enforcement.
And I'm getting bids on the removal of my burnt turf as well. So, interesting times we live in. Anything else from the commission? Nope. All right then. This is the time for public business from the floor on non-agendized items, and there are no public persons present. So we'll move to adjournment to our special meeting for agenda review Monday, July 13th, 2015 at 5:30 p.m. in the now Parks, Recreation, and Arts Conference Room here at City Hall. Thank you all for your work tonight, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.